Hi everyone, this is Meredith Ward with NASCIO. We will get started here in just a minute or two. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Meredith Ward with NASCIO. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. And greetings from Northern Virginia. I'm currently at a National Governors Association cybersecurity meeting. So I will be joining for the first couple minutes and then signing off. But you will be in wonderful hands with my colleague Eric Sweden, Amy Glasscock, and also our fabulous CIO from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and also our IT Procurement Committee co-chair, John McMillan. But just wanted to start out today by telling everybody really why we decided to hold this webinar, what NASCIO is working on with IT procurement modernization, and so on. So you might remember last year NASCIO released a set of 5 recommendations for improved IT procurement. Since that time, we've been working with the National Association of State Procurement Officials on IT procurement reform and have really, I think, gotten some good things accomplished, and we continue to work this year. But anyway, one of the 5 recommendations was to leverage enterprise architecture for improved IT procurement. And you should be able to see that on your screen right now. And for more information, we have information on our website, or you can feel free to contact me about that campaign. But really one of the most, obviously one of the most important of the 5 to really use enterprise architecture for the betterment of IT procurement. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so with that short introduction, I'll go ahead. I will turn it over to my colleague, Eric Sweden, who's the director of our Enterprise Architecture Program at NASCIO. Thanks so much.
Very good. Thank you, Meredith, and special thanks as well to Amy Glasscock, Emily Lane, and Daniel Dokes. All of those folks are behind the scenes helping us with this webinar, so thanks to all of them. I'll be very brief because we want you to hear from John McMillan. So just in the way of background, and John's contributed to this as well as other CIOs and architects, we've been able to make a strong case for collaboration between EA, enterprise architecture, and procurement. They have to fit together hand in glove, and we've published in detail on this relationship. Check out our publications on our NASCIO Resource Center under Procurement, and you'll see more on this. But to understand this relationship, it's important to understand how we define enterprise architecture. And the way we do that is we're looking at enterprise architecture as a very holistic operating discipline, and our publications have presented on this many times. So one of the defenses of that definition is we are stating without this holistic view of the state enterprise, our efforts towards optimization will be marginal. We also need to maintain a certain agility or ability to act quickly to either meet a need or mandate or exploit an opportunity. So enterprise architecture is something that provides that capability and agility. So as we have presented in a number of presentations and publications, we created this graphic, which is essentially a shorthand way of presenting enterprise architecture. starting with a constant vigil on what is happening at the statewide level, nationally and globally, and we maintain this contextual awareness no matter what we're doing, so we're always relevant. Within this context, we evaluate opportunities and needs. With that understanding, we in state government commit to pursuing an opportunity or need. Then we must have a clear, explicit, strategic set of intentions. So those intentions are fulfilled through capabilities, a key ingredient. And those capabilities are acquired, they're leased, they're rented, they're partnered for. You know, there's a number of ways we acquire those capabilities. And this is where procurement partners with us and delivers those capabilities. So of course, procurement must understand this EA perspective in order to understand what we're trying to accomplish. And EA, enterprise architecture, must understand the procurement discipline in order to properly engage it. So for all states and territories within NASCIO, it all becomes centric on priorities. You know, what are the states working on? And every year we publish a top 10 list of priorities from our state CIOs. This is a list of their priorities, and we'll engage both enterprise architecture and procurement disciplines to address these priorities. We also talk about these priorities for the states within our survey, annual surveys of state CIOs. So we're after outcomes, and some of the outcomes that are sought are program outcomes from the various agencies, and there are enterprise-wide outcomes. So if we're operating as a single enterprise, we're trying to simplify our investments. Fewer kinds, less variety, tied to enterprise-wide standards across the entire investment portfolio, bringing economic efficiencies in hardware, software, services, contracting, all of which impact a number of areas, including human resources, training, and most important, citizen engagement. So there's a whole host of other effects we're trying to achieve. This is exactly what John is seeking to achieve in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with his vision for bringing these disciplines of enterprise architecture and procurement together. Ultimately, the citizen benefits. So with that introduction, we'll turn the presentation over to John McMillan, CIO for the Commonwealth. Welcome, John. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric. And I am not alone in this afternoon's undertaking. With me is Patty Chapman, who is the Director of IT Procurement for the Commonwealth. Please say hi.
Hello.
And Eric, I see that we've advanced the slide deck. So before we get started on going through this list, let me just say that as I joined the procurement committee and started to do some research, what I discovered, and I hope I'm not alone in this, is the realization that 4 of our major processes for managing IT are not necessarily integrated. And let me explain what I mean by that. And it serves as the basis for most of the rest of the discussion. When we compose a service, we have to make decisions about what we retain internally and what we buy externally. So as we go through that design, we are almost automatically implying that procurement has to be in lockstep with us. And as Patty frequently reminds me, that if procurement is not in the first 5 lines of your project plan, you're probably going to be late. So we've got to find a way to more tightly integrate all of the processes we use to manage IT and create common models and a significant integration of language so that when IT says something, procurement knows what we're talking about, and all of the other business functions that we rely on know what we're talking about, whether it's HR or legal or the business. So when we look at this slide that talks about the goals and we talk about tightly integrated process, procurement, governance, and service management, that's what our intent is. How do we make these things work better together. And so the purpose of the discussion is to create a model where we can continue to have these discussions. I have a strong sense that this will not be the last discussion on these topics. Ultimately, governance is about who has the right to make which decisions, and we'll talk more about that. And what we are trying to do is drive down the risk to the business and the business processes that rely on IT services. We have to have a good, effective model for understanding which components are at risk and when they need to be refreshed or replaced, that we're doing that in a clear, concise way that survives perhaps a change of administration or change a person in a role. And the key element from my perspective to make that happen is where are the architectural models to make that happen? It is a little bit of the chicken and egg story. Which came first, the architectural model or the existing system that's in production? And the last piece of it is, if we don't know what we want to get out of IT, the principles that we've established to deliver value to the enterprise, it's going to be difficult to measure and demonstrate our success. And the key element in all of this is language, so that we can have clear communication amongst all the stakeholders. So that's the backdrop. And Eric, if you could jump to the next slide. We're going to talk through a number of models this afternoon that ultimately leads us back to where we started. So this is a model that we've adopted in Pennsylvania to try to describe how does the IT deliver value back to the business. And it's a bit of a governance model, but it includes the four major disciplines that we'll talk about this afternoon. The IT service lifecycle, or IT service management, architecture, governance, and procurement that underpin how we deliver and demonstrate value. When strategies are established at the business level, we get to select and fund projects that ultimately get implemented and create an operational environment based upon infrastructure that we typically have to buy or acquire or lease or manage in some way. That creates this technical debt. And so long as we are operating these environments, we have to carefully balance what we need, what we want, and what we might like to have across all four disciplines. Again, service management, architecture, governance, and procurement. We'll move on to the next slide. So this is an ITIL-based model for managing services across their life cycle. And as the previous slide demonstrates, once we selected a project, we've essentially launched part of the service life cycle. What this slide is trying to communicate is the need for process integration. So when we're managing demand or creating a service portfolio or deciding to launch a new service, we need to know what model, what business architecture are we trying to support, what other architectures are in there, including data and application, and ultimately what we're going to do internally or retain, and what we need to buy or lease or acquire somehow externally through procurement. And again, as I said earlier, what I have found is that there is little knowledge about how to make these processes integrate. We rely heavily on the people involved in the process execution. There's little commonality amongst the disciplines in terms of language and documents and work products. So that's going to be our challenge, and it's also our opportunity. How do we pull these disciplines together? So we're going to move on to the next slide. And this slide talks about service composition. It is also an ITIL-based model, and there are 3 or 4 pieces I'm going to draw your attention to. What the model talks about are the major components of a service, an IT service that supports the business. And the major components include utility, warranty, assets or resources, capabilities, and so on. What I'm trying to indicate here is that when we're designing a service, we automatically have to engage the other disciplines. In the upper part of the model, we see the need to connect to the governance process. What are the steps are we following? Who's making the decision about what products and what the service is trying to do? In the middle part of the diagram, we see architectural implications. What's our infrastructure? What's our environment? What's our data? And what are our applications? We'll talk more about that in one of the next slides. And down at the bottom, this is about people. What do we do internally? And what do we buy externally or suppliers? And in these compositions, again, all of the processes, the steps that we follow, the outputs that we create, the input that we intake, all of it must be orchestrated to work together. We're going to move on to the next slide. This is my spin on something that Eric talked about earlier. This is my spin on architecture. And I present it this way because I'm going to try to connect it to the other 3 disciplines, and I'll do that using color and words. So on the left is the architectural model. We need a model for the business. What is the business architecture? How is it designed? How does it operate? How could we, in a 2-dimensional space on a piece of paper, contemplate what its functions are? Is it involved in inspections or licensing or credentialing? How does that work from an executive, management, and operational perspective? What applications are needed to support that? And what's the architecture for those applications? What technology does it sit on? And most importantly, how does data flow through the organization? The I in CIO means something, and I'm trying to indicate that we need architects to help us conceptualize and document what is going on here, so that when we make determinations of how we're going to manage a service, what decisions need to be made to enable it and sustain it, and what we need to buy, all of these things have to be working together. So the element in the middle is some of the outputs from architectural activities, conceptual models, roadmaps, not just for services, but also products. What are the architectural requirements and how do they integrate? What's the knowledge? People frequently say that enterprise architecture is the memory of the organization. So how are we managing that knowledge? Where is it stored? How do we access it? What do we do when we substitute components in the architecture and that knowledge is no longer needed? How do we take guidance from the people performing those activities and deliver that through guidance to some of the other areas? How do we reuse some of the components that are already in that operational environment? Why do we need to rebuild a licensing application if we already have one? How do we change it? What's an alternative solution? How do we improve it so that Agency A can use some of the components that were previously established by Agency B. On the right-hand side of this slide is the connection to the other areas. And the color coding ties back to the service lifecycle. So how do we make those pieces work? And then below that, who needs to make what decisions as we go forward? That's the governance piece. And then what do we need to buy? So that, again, that's my spin on the architectural piece. On the next slide, I offer an IT governance model. And you'll notice in the right-hand side, under framework, is a very clear reference to IT architecture. And it is the logic for some of the things I talked about before, the data, the applications, and the infrastructure. So when we talk about governance, I frequently ask the question, govern what? And this framework is meant to establish what we govern. So when people get together in organizational structures to direct, evaluate, or monitor the outcomes of projects and operations, we need to be talking about principles, architecture, applications, infrastructure, and money. That's the framework. Both of these pieces, architecture and money, automatically tie back to procurement. If we don't know what we're buying and we don't know how much it costs, how can we ask our procurement partners to go place an order? And if we don't have the right terms and conditions and we don't have the right sourcing arrangements, how could we buy it from the get-go? If you've ever been on a project where you get partway into the schedule and somebody starts talking about procurement being a problem, it's probably bad planning. On the left-hand side is a model for a governance process. And the key pieces here are near the bottom, where we're making decisions about projects that become operational. And in that operational environment, we have an automatic connection back to IT service management. This slide is intended to reinforce the idea that all four of these disciplines have to work together. We're going to jump to the next slide. And Patty's going to speak for a little while.
Hi, good afternoon. Just before I begin with my slide, I want to share a brief overview of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's IT spend just to help frame the discussion. So over our last fiscal year, our IT spend with external vendors was approximately $746 million. Now the majority of that, almost 70%, is for contracted services, and that trend is fairly consistent with prior fiscal years. Software, telecommunications, and hardware, although they are still as important to our overall service delivery process, they're a much smaller piece of the IT spend pie. Now, one of the major challenges of serving in state government are the shifts in direction that we encounter as our administration naturally changes through an election cycle. Other changes may be required to support recommendations from either organizational assessments or cost-saving studies. Pennsylvania's HR, IT, and procurement functions are currently undergoing those changes now. For the last 6 years, IT in Pennsylvania had responsibility for IT procurement. In July of this year, that responsibility is returning to the agency that has legislative oversight for all procurement. It is more than critical now that we develop a model framework incorporating enterprise architecture, governance, service management, and procurement that will be sustainable through the changes regardless of where the authority for IT procurement lies. So historically, procurement has been in more of a reactive rather than proactive role. This often occurs, as John mentioned earlier, either because of improper planning or because the business need may have been legislatively enacted without the thought of the processes required to effectively carry out that mandate. It's easy to be proactive when we're all involved in strategic planning and the upfront activities, but more often than not, we've been on the back end of the project plan. So another major challenge with our technology sourcing is that lack of integration between the disciplines that John talked about earlier. We believe that some, if not all of those challenges can be overcome through collaboration and cooperation between the people responsible for EA, governance, service management, and procurement. As John talked about learning the same language, we also need to respect each area's needs to meet customer demands and oftentimes regulatory requirements. From an IT procurement perspective, over the last few years, we've been trying to bridge the gap by investing in ITIL training for procurement staff. Currently, all IT procurement staff have a minimum of ITIL foundation training. The overarching framework represents that need for active engagement in all of the program areas that we talked about, including the support network, such as our budget and financial specialists to our legal counsel. If every area has a seat at the table, we can be better informed at the onset. And if they're not at the table, we should at least inform and consult them throughout the process. Now, realizing that the public procurement process was designed to ensure that tax dollars are appropriately spent and that our vendor community is treated fairly, the process can often be criticized as not being innovative or flexible because there is always the fear of legal and policy and procedural constraints that govern our process. So if we have that adequate representation and influence from all throughout the process, it helps build a better procurement, and it helps with the follow-on contract management and compliance processes. Each of those stages build the foundation for an overall successful procurement. We know technology sourcing is not one-size-fits-all, and our business processes and applications are not a one-size-fits-all. Being in the public sector, we run the gamut. So we have some standard back-end processing systems, such as our HR payroll, accounting and budgeting, our ERP system. But we also have very unique applications, such as newborn screening, medical marijuana tracking, and lottery and gaming systems, just to name a few. So when we start with that need being identified and the business ensuring that there's proper funding to proceed, that is the ideal time to bring all parties to the table so that the good work of assessing the marketplace, conducting industry research can begin. I wanted to highlight one example that the Commonwealth used, and it was for our telecommunications contract overhaul. We had a long-term contract that is expiring in October of 2019, and we know that this is an area that is ever-changing. Because we were all involved early on, we had the time to survey the vendor community, to gather information on what to incorporate when planning our replacement contract. And we also could focus on the industry-leading services that could meet security and business needs of our state government. Because we had the time to collaborate with all and properly plan, we had that opportunity to provide the vendor community with information on where we are today and ask them where we should be going tomorrow. We had time to assess the market, we had time to get written feedback from vendors, and then we were able to select certain respondents to conduct presentations to us in what we call the vendor symposium. So overall, that was a great success, and we had everyone represented and at the table. When we have time to engage and collaborate, we can ensure that the upfront sourcing strategy leads us into a successful procurement strategy, and that the contractual relationships with our service providers can be effectively managed through the contract management and compliance process. So can we move on to that next slide, Eric? I want to focus a bit more on how the outcomes of EA ensure the success of the procurement process. Talked a lot about early engagement and teamwork during the sourcing process, and when we have the ability to work collaboratively to support the business and the technology service providers. We have better time to understand customer needs, do that research in the industry, identify appropriate or problematic terms and conditions, and then determine what is important to the business and technology so those can be prioritized for evaluation criteria used in that follow-on procurement process. So the EA part of it will ensure that the procurement process delivers a solution that meets the needs of the business, as well as proper alignment with our existing technical landscape. We know that our technology procurements are far-reaching, in that the solution must meet, one, the business needs of the organization and its constituents, protect data, integrate with other applications, as well as play nicely within our current network. So in addition to the internal benefits, this approach also provides the vendor community with a firm vision, which can help reduce their risk when responding to our requests for proposals, and hopefully as well drive down some costs. Next slide, Eric, please. On the prior two slides, the discussion was mainly about the services component of our spend. For this slide, we shift our focus to the underpinning products. Although our expenditures are smaller in the areas of software and hardware, the management process and integration to EA and procurement is just as important. Now, this slide provides a color-coded view of the service management process for our underpinning products, from the identification of the need to the decommissioning and disposal and everything in between. Although most of the process is handled through service transition processes, the point of this slide is to demonstrate that EA, governance, and procurement integration do not end when a product goes live. Next slide.
And Eric, I'm going to pick this one back up. So as Patty just mentioned, once we've made the decision through governance to launch a project and we start the service management lifecycle for those elements, we are headed towards ongoing process integration. And it's vital that inputs and outputs and all of the processes work together. And the key element in all of this is language. So that when we're sitting in a group and we know that we've got folks from other functions in our organization, that we are clear and concise about what we need and what we want. So as Patty mentioned, one of the things that we've done in Pennsylvania is we've started training our procurement folks on the IT information library. So how we manage our services isn't a mystery. That what we are going to do when we establish a new service and we need to acquire products, hardware, software, or services from external suppliers, and then how they will be established and integrated and operated in a live production environment. It's vital that we have this shared understanding. It's a key element in every family, and it's a key element in every organization. So the recommendations that we've generated are as follows. Architecture has to be part of it. If we don't have the models, then it's difficult for those who come after us to understand how something was designed and implemented. We've got to have this level of high quality documentation. When we produce these models, when we have clear requirements, and as Patty said, through our telecom example, having our telecom architects driving some of these things and getting the team together early in the process is leading us towards a successful outcome. That works well internally. It also works extremely well externally. When we're clear about our strategies, we're able to have a clear, concise message to our external supplier community. They know where we are, they know where we're going, they know what our service catalog is, they know what components are in it, and they know what they can sell into that environment. It creates less frustration, and it creates less churn when we are pursuing an innovative idea that stands alone relative to our portfolio. That transparency helps all of the stakeholders. We need to keep investing in architecture. We need to have people that have the right training, the right certification, so that they can build the models that transcend agencies. And we can identify opportunities for business process integration and ultimately IT service integration with an extreme focus on data. In the Commonwealth, we spend a lot of money moving data amongst agencies, and we are driving towards less of this data movement and better data integration. And as we've said frequently during this afternoon's discussion, language is the key. It helps with communication, it helps with change and release management, and it ultimately helps all of the professionals across the 4 disciplines that we've discussed this afternoon work more effectively together. In January of this year, the Commonwealth launched a major shared services initiative. And a lot of what we're talking about today is underpinning the design elements of the shared services project. This project will ultimately bring together in a single organization all internal IT professionals and HR professionals in the Commonwealth. We will create a single organization. And we've described how we want the language of that organization to be applied this afternoon. Eric, we're going to turn it back to you.
Very good, John. Patty, thank you very much for presenting to us this afternoon. There's a few questions. One is, as you embarked on this vision of this partnering between procurement and enterprise architecture, and really your office, how did you get that started? Because you would have had to have done some, first of all, some intelligence gathering to find out who are strategic partners for you, identifying procurement as clearly that part of that, and then reaching out to some level within procurement, maybe the procurement officer to start with, to engage them. So could you speak a little bit about how you actually created that relationship, that partnering with procurement?
Yes. So as I introduced Patty, who is the IT director, Patty actually today works in the CIO's office. So we have a natural affinity. We work in the same organization. But as Patty mentioned during her presentation, that relationship is delegated out of our central procurement organization. As part of the shared services initiative, that reporting responsibility is going to change in, well, let's say 15 or 16 days. So that the procurement function that is in IT in the CIO's office today will return to the Department of General Services.
Okay, so Patty will have solid line to the procurement office in that time, and dotted line to you, or how does that work?
So today it's solid line. So the IT procurement organization today is solid line to the CIO, but on July 1st it's going to become dotted line. So Eric, I'll be straight with you. Part of this afternoon's discussion is the model that we want to use inside the Commonwealth when that direct line, reported line relationship changes in just a couple of weeks.
Very good. Nice timing on our webinar. So, as you look ahead to, yeah, go ahead.
Patty has.
So this is Patty. I just wanted to add to that. One of the first activities that we did as an IT procurement, as a new bureau within the Office for Information Technology, was to establish regular ongoing meetings with our customers, and we viewed our customers as the agency CIOs and technology managers. So it was really procurement taking that initiative to say, we want to meet with you regularly, we want to hear what's coming up, we want to see how we can position ourselves to help support you. And although not everyone took advantage of that, we had a lot of customers who did, and it just helped establish those relationships and give us a little bit of foresight into what was coming. So as the organization now is shifting and being absorbed back into the agency that has legislative authority, we've made that commitment to keep that ongoing communication, just make sure that it doesn't disintegrate at this point, because we want to make sure that we can continue to be successful.
So Eric, if you think about the disciplines, right, from a service management piece, we need procurement in lockstep with us, regardless of the reporting relationship. But I think what Patty is trying to say, the key element is the business relationship and the folks involved in managing that business relationship, whether it's on demand or strategy or portfolio or service composition or product roadmaps. And all of these things now have overlapping implications into architecture. And then ultimately somebody needs to make a decision, and then that goes right back to governance. In what I said,
very good. Another question would be,
go ahead.
Well, another question would be, as you look at enterprise portfolio management then, is Patty then spending time with your portfolio management team periodically to just look at the full landscape of investment and discuss strategy going forward with, here's what's coming in the way of projects, here's what we have in the way of investments so far, here's how that should change in future, and Patty is part of that discussion along with the architects on a continual ongoing basis and back and forth. So as procurement is acquired this role, when you're trying to even market the concepts of enterprise, Patty's going with those, presenting to say, hey, procurement's behind this 100%. We're trying to get to an enterprise portfolio management discipline, looking across the enterprise, and we're part of that.
So Eric, in today's world, we have ongoing project reviews, and yes, procurement was always included as part of that review, as well as our enterprise architecture team, our project management office, and our enterprise security office as well. So as an OIT organization that had responsibility for procurement, we did try to keep everybody at the table. And going forward, that's one of the actions that we want to make sure continue, that we have that integration.
Very good. The references you have here, John, where do you acquire these? Is there a website that we could present as well for the suggested reading list?
They're available on the Open Group website.
Okay, the Open Group. Okay, thank you. Good. Any follow-up on Patty's comments regarding enterprise portfolio management, John?
Part of what we're trying to establish is the, if you will, the RACI for how these processes integrate. There is a lot of information and knowledge about each of the areas in and of themselves, but the interfaces between those disciplines is what I'm talking about in terms of integration. How do we take a conceptual model out of the architecture discipline and turn that into a requisition for procurement? How do we make that more effective? And, where possible, how could we automate it? These are some of the things that we're trying to overcome.
So as we look ahead, you know, we're doing research currently with Accenture on Agile approaches, and that's impacting a lot of this relationship you're discussing as well. In fact, in some states, procurement is getting certified in Agile approaches, so they are very aware of how that whole dynamic works. So are you looking at any future or maybe even current modifications to this relationship between EA, procurement, regarding these types of methods that are different from traditional waterfall, but more of Agile types of approaches? How's that impacting you?
And Eric, if you could jump back to slide 14. One more. Okay. So the pressures that exist in the business environment to get solutions to citizens and businesses faster is ever increasing. And the only way we can do that is to operate, from my perspective, in a risk management environment. And rather than Agile, I'd like to call it nimble. We have to respect our processes that are established in statute. We have to respect the budgeting process. And we have to manage risk so that when we get deep into the public spend, there isn't more at risk for our external suppliers, and there isn't more at risk in the public purse. So the approach we're taking is something that we're going to call incremental innovation. So we have to get faster at doing things, and we still have to follow all of the processes. So how do we take large procurements and start to break them down? Patty mentioned our telecom. One of the things that we did was we took a monolithic business relationship and broke it up into 4 or 5 pieces. And in those designs, we talked extensively about how do we make this work and how do we give agencies more choice, more selection, while still establishing the budget and the auditability of all of the process. Those requirements don't change no matter how much business pressure there is. The other aspect is that as Agile becomes more prevalent from an application development perspective, we would like to extend it to, say, again, a more nimble IT service management, governance, and procurement environment. All those pieces have to work together. Agile almost by definition means that the business and IT have to be in lockstep. So we're looking at...
So another question for you then, that lockstep is much easier to achieve relatively internally, but what happens when you start to partner in cross-jurisdictional ways, for instance, partnering maybe with counties or cities or other states even? Has that come into the equation yet, or is that on the horizon for you?
So are you talking about cooperative purchasing, or I want to make sure I'm understanding your question.
Sure, understand. Okay, Patty. So that would be one approach, would be cooperative purchasing, but another case may be where, in fact, you're joining up at the very beginning with requirements. Or it could be, as we've seen in Michigan, where counties and other local governments have come up with solutions and the state adopts them. You know, they say, gosh, we could use that at the state level as well. And so the portfolio is now a mix of things that have been internally created or contracted for, but also external things coming into that portfolio. And there's a lot of implications, most particularly, as John had mentioned earlier, data. So now procurement is kind of sort of expanding into or touching into that other jurisdiction, and their procurement's touching you. So have you gotten into that space yet where, in fact, the collaborative that's sitting around the table, the decision rights John mentioned, now we're expanding to outside of the Commonwealth to local government maybe or other states.
So
how is that shaping up?
To focus on doing the best job possible for our state government before we start including everybody else into our sandbox. Our contracts today, several of them are eligible for what we call piggybacking or cooperative purchasing. There is a Department of General Services who has the legislative oversight for procurement. They have what they call a co-stars program. That's what they call the program. That's the cooperative purchasing. So they're managing those contracts today, but from an IT procurement perspective, we have not embarked on anything that was far-reaching to our local procurement entities as one particular contract. So we have statewide contracts in place that are eligible for piggybacking by those entities, and a lot of them use them today. City of Philadelphia is a user of our software contracts. So they use them today. We just haven't included them in our requirements for any specific type of contract.
And Eric, that's just another way of saying we're trying to leverage the purchasing power of all of the Commonwealth, and it opens the doors for suppliers to talk to us about what's in their service catalog and how their products and services and solutions might integrate with ours.
Very good. So you've actually helped the partnering or the partnering you do with outside contractors as well. Since you have this discipline, they're coming in with some helpful bounding on responding to requests for information or requests for proposals. You've got the discipline, I would imagine. Corporate partners welcome. And have you heard any comments back from your corporate partners to say, this is perfect, this is really nice, this is helping us respond to your needs?
We got thank you letters for the telecom symposium. So yes, we have heard feedback. We also hear feedback when they believe that we haven't done something well, but it's rare to get a note of appreciation or a thank you, and we received several from that effort.
Very good.
And Eric, we work collaboratively through a number of technology councils spread out across the state to help communicate our strategy, what our procurement code is, and how best to work through the established process.
Very good. I'm looking for more questions on the chat. We have had one, and there aren't other questions that I see here. But what we'd like to do is extend to everyone the invitation to send any additional questions to us through email. I've got John's email here, and Meredith and myself, and we'll send those questions on to John from here and Patty, and we will respond to those questions. But this has been an excellent update on the work of the Commonwealth, and specifically John and Patty bringing these two functions together. What would be, Patty's moving over solid line to the Chief Procurement Officer in a few days, but what other major events are you anticipating in your ongoing approach here? What's the next big thing for you, John and Patty?
So Eric, the function of procurement is moving over to the Department of General Services, but I'm going to remain in the Office for Information Technology to support our ongoing IT transformation efforts and ensure that that integration continues with procurement.
And
John,
Eric,
other events coming?
Eric, our shared services initiative will start again to pull together IT professionals and HR professionals into a single organization, we're going to establish groups of agencies and matrix those professionals back out. We're going to elevate certain services into the enterprise, so they will be designed and delivered centrally, and then there will be other services that will be delivered out of these groups. We have a lot of interesting things going on in Pennsylvania.
I want to get some updates from you, John and Patty, going forward, so we want you to come back and give us additional updates. You've done excellent work here in the Commonwealth, and we sure appreciate you coming here today. I want to give a few updates here. One is we've got another webinar coming up next week, June 22nd. I believe that's next week, yes. Digital Transformation in Government, the Illinois Blockchain Initiative webinar, set for 3 o'clock. So please look for the notification, registration, and join us for that webinar. And with that, I'd like to just go around the table here, see if there's any final comments. Meredith, are you still on, please?
I think Meredith had to return to her meeting in Virginia.
Okay, very good. And then John and Patty, let's start with John. Any parting comments, any final observations before we close this webinar, please?
Thanks for the opportunity to tell the story from Pennsylvania. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And Patty?
I'm good, thank you.
All right. Well, again, thank you both very much. Thank you all of the participants that joined us this afternoon, and look for the publication of this webinar on our website. We'll send the slides to everyone who's registered, and we wish you a good afternoon. Stay tuned to NASCIO. Thank you.